Well, hello again. Welcome to is this episode number 4? Our fourth episode of Sermon B-Sides. My name is Rusten. I'm one of the pastors of Coram Deo Church, and I'm here with Pastor John from Coram Deo Church as well, and we're excited to be with you. We're going to be talking more about Psalms as we've been going through the Psalm series in the last several weeks, and I think we're now at our 10th Psalm, 11th Psalm we've been going through. And so one of the things that comes to mind that we wanted to tee off this episode with is bourbon, which I've gotten in the habit of almost forgetting to talk about bourbon. So, John, what are you drinking today?
Today, I'm drinking something very special. I don't know that this is available to the general public. So this was a gift from Nate and Chick. So thank you. From Louisiana. It is called Sugarfield Straight Bourbon. It's 92 proof, and this is super cool. This is only the third batch to come out of this distillery, and it is quite good. It's on the mellow side, which is nice. A little sweet, a little caramely, very pleasant.
Very cool. Well, I'm drinking an oldie but a goodie for me, and I don't think I've shared this before in the last 4 episodes, but this is Rowan's Creek. Rowan's Creek, and it's in that collective of distilleries that does like Willett and Noah's Mill. Okay. But this is one that I kind of stumbled upon a long time ago, and it's become one of my favorites. And this is a bottle that my wife bought me for my birthday in June.
Very cool. What's the proof on it?
The proof on this one is 101 proof, so 50.5%.
Yeah, that's good. So cheers.
All right, so the topic of is that good? What's the flavor? What's the flavor profile?
It's got like this kind of smooth, almost cool vanilla thing that just kind of lingers after it goes down. I don't think I've ever had that in a bourbon. It shows up. Usually the later profile is like hot and burn, but this is like cool vanilla, and then like I don't know, 7 seconds later you start to feel a little burn on it. This is quite good.
This one is like a little bit of a. There's different. I'd say there's different. You either have really sweet and caramely, or you have like on the almost like sour side, but not sour, but like more punchy.
Yes. And
fruity maybe.
Yep.
This for a bourbon is way more on the fruity side.
Is it?
Yes, and with some definite like char oak notes, but on the fruity side for sure.
The fact that we're drinking this at 6 a.m. also may affect the palate. So
yeah, nobody knows when we're recording these.
By the way, it's not 6 a.m, just so you know.
No, it's not. Although it could be.
It could be.
Really all right. Good. So Psalms.
Right. Where are we going here?
Psalms. It's good songs to lift a glass to. So the topic, kind of, if I had to give a header for the name of this episode, I would call it worship as warfare, or worship as weapon. And the reason why I give it that title or that kind of header is because in the sermon, when you were preaching on Psalm 29, you came up to me. I was in the sound booth learning to do sound, and you kind of came over to me, and you were wearing your mask, and you were like, I think the Lord's Supper is like picking a fight. And so I just want you to kind of unpack a little bit what you mean by that, because I think it's actually incredibly profound.
Yeah. So a little shout out before I dive into it, that if those of you watching don't know, that's actually that was the birth of B-Sides, because Rusten and I would have these little comments, usually between sermons, in the back of the room or after serving communion or between the service, and that would lead to discussions. And so that's how this whole thing came into place. These little comments that take place between services on Sunday. So, anyways, communion is kind of like picking a fight. Yeah, and I think I would maybe it'd be more appropriate to say communion is kind of like mocking the enemies.
Mm.
But there is very similar
Yeah.
nature. So when I was reading through First Corinthians, another side note, know when you're preaching and you read a text and you've prepared all week for it, and maybe it's a text that like First Corinthians 11 that I've read, I mean, almost every other Sunday as we do communion, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then one word in that text will pop that you're like, oh, I never noticed that word
Yes.
before, or an idea, even though you've studied all week for it, right? It just happens. So on Sunday, when I was reading it for communion, the end of verse 26, it just, I don't know, it landed on my soul a little differently. So it says, this is 1 Corinthians 11, for as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes.
Mm.
And so I've always connected that in communion, that like we're looking forward to the return of our King, which I think is clearly part of what's happening in communion. But I thought about, what does it mean to drink to the return of the King in the midst of a world that looks like the King is losing, right?
Yeah.
So when you have sin and chaos and godlessness everywhere, and in the midst of this mess, you have this community of people who come together and toast to the King, who on the outside, it looks like the King is defeated and the Christians are the most foolish people in the world.
Yes.
But on the inside, we're chuckling, going, he's coming. You know what I mean? So it's like there's a certain sense in which there's a mocking.
Yes.
To the enemies of God, and also a mocking to the spiritual forces of darkness that I think I said in the sermon that our enemies, the resurrection of Christ means that our enemies are vanquished foes. So they're an active rebellion fighting against the people of God, and yet they're defeated. And communion is like a toast to that.
Yes.
So.
Yes, that's good. It reminds me of a couple things. First, this idea that in the resurrection of Christ, the foes are vanquished.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously reminds me of Colossians, where it talks about how in his death and resurrection, he made a spectacle, right, of the powers, right? Yes. And that's a theme that comes up a lot in the New Testament and in all scripture, actually, is this notion of the powers, the authorities. And in our last episode, we were talking about the authorities and powers and this political edge in Psalms, and how there is in the background behind so many of these other kingdoms, these other rulers, these other people that have power, a darkness, right? There's oftentimes, and I think that any student of history would affirm that there's something, Lord Acton's most famous, saying, right, where he says, power corrupts, right? Absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? Yeah. And I think that it doesn't do that because there's something inherently bad about power. Mm-hmm. It does that because there are forces and there is a depraved human nature at play, right? There's a depraved human nature that wants power, and in the seeds of the heart of human nature is the anger that I have towards my neighbor or somebody who upsets me can grow into something wildly disturbing if I have a ton of power. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And then, but that's one factor of it. The other factor of it is there's actually spiritual darkness. Yeah. That is bent towards mounting an offense against God and overthrowing his good creation. Yeah. Right. And so those themes are pretty consistent through scripture. Mm-hmm. And if I had to say there's a kind of constant theme also through scripture, it's that God's defeating those things. Yes. And has decisively done so in Christ's death and resurrection. Yes. And so that's where when you said we're picking a fight or we're mocking or we're taunting with communion, it's the celebration of the foes are dead, that they've been defanged. Yeah. when you play chess, there's several, you can know who's going to win several moves before the actual checkmate happens.
Right.
It's in one of those situations where they're living on borrowed time.
They are living on borrowed time, but they don't know it.
Exactly. Yes.
So
they rage. Yes.
It's a little bit like Rome crucifying Christ. And it's like, great, we did it. It's like, no, you just did yourself in.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? So it comes. One thing that came to mind, we were thinking about mocking kind of the darkness, mocking the enemies. And our enemies, because of the resurrection, being vanquished foes. I think that there's kind of two ditches that we can fall into. And one is maybe an over realized eschatology, which might say there are no more foes because Christ defeated them, and an under realized eschatology that just tends to see the church as like a helpless victim.
Yes.
And the reality is that there are actual enemies and they do bad stuff, and yet they are vanquished.
Yes.
And so that's why a Christian can acknowledge real suffering and yet have joy in the midst of it, because we can acknowledge the reality of the darkness, and yet the darkness isn't ultimate.
Yes.
The resurrected Christ is. And so that's why we can mock. It's not out of ignorance.
Yes.
And it's also not a defeatism.
Yeah. What I love about that is that scenario of living in between those two ditches creates a temperament of what I would call serious jolliness. Like, we can be jolly, but we have the weight of the seriousness around us.
Yes.
It's like, it reminds me of Psalm 23. We talked about this earlier. We're praising God that you provide, you set a table for me in the presence of my enemies.
Yeah.
And it's not a table of meager proportions.
Right.
It's a feast. And it's what do you do at feasts? You laugh, you drink, you cheers, you praise, you sing, and all the while, I remember when I preached on Psalm 23. That's one thing that the commentator I had read brought up, is that the language in the psalm there is so it's so taunty.
Mm-hmm.
I force the enemies to watch my people enjoy the feast I give them.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And so,
because otherwise, feasting in front of your enemies doesn't sound good.
No. Well, it sounds like, why did we pick this spot?
Yes, exactly.
Right. So there's
socially distanced from your enemies, though, of course.
Yes. Yeah. Wait, I'm not sure I heard what you said.
Socially distanced.
Yes, socially distanced. Yes, be careful.
Yeah.
Don't want to watch out for that. I knew there was a something of humor in there. So, but I think that's also, worship is reverent, but worship is also joyful.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
Worship is serious because the realities that we're talking about are so deep, right? And the holiness of God is so wide, so stark in contrast to our own sinfulness. And yet we have a God who humbles himself and loves us and brings us to himself so that we can feast and have laughter. Yeah. And we can rejoice. And that the temperament of that story and what that produces in you is that's one of the things that I think that to me makes just the reality of Christianity so just drawn. I'm just drawn to nowhere else will you find such serious joy and the ability to not take yourself seriously. I take God seriously, which allows me to not to take myself seriously.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so there's a kind of a joy there that and it's interesting because you think about cultures where Christianity is not is not there's no heritage of Christianity there, and oftentimes there you won't see that. So we were talking earlier about like communist regimes, right?
Yeah.
And where I don't think that what those regimes and those countries are known for is a joyful seriousness because of the wondrous grace and the wondrous seriousness of God and the grace with which we've been saved, right? So
yes.
But you were also talking something. You were also talking about communism also in light of there is a real enemy, right? There's a real darkness, right? And in communism, you kind of see this. I think you asked a question that that you could ask now, because I can't remember it exactly. But what were you talking about with communism and Christianity?
I think I asked why must communism always do away with the church?
Okay.
Why does it have to get rid of the church?
Why is that?
You want me to answer that?
Yeah, answer it.
Because the Communist Party understands something about the nature of the church that we as the church often don't get. And that is the church is the greatest threat to communism.
Yep.
Because the church has not only a king, but because we have a king, we have a future and we have a hope. And so we don't look to the state as being ultimate. We have a king who gives us joy. We have a king that we pledge allegiance to. We have a king that we joyfully submit to. And we look to him for our daily bread.
Yes.
And in order for communism and Marxism, in order for that to work, the state must be ultimate.
Yeah.
And there can be no rival eschatologies. There can be no rival gospels. There can be no rival lords. And that's why when you look at the history of communism, you'll see that communist regimes always attack and destroy and try and put the church down. And it's because they understand the political edge of the church.
That's good. And it's interesting. You mentioned the eschatology of the church and of the gospel and how it's. I think you mentioned earlier. I don't know if you did it while on camera, but how it's in conflict with the eschatology of communism. Right?
Yeah,
it's in complete conflict with their story and where it's going.
Yes,
and how it's actually the eschatology of Christianity and of the church that gives us reason to be jolly.
Right.
Because it gives us hope even beyond the tragedy, right?
Yes.
So,
yeah. So a personal comment about that.
Yeah.
There was, I want to say, I don't know, somewhere around 9 years ago, I had this moment where I realized that I was like inwardly frantic about like the state of the church and church planting and all that stuff. And I started to notice certain leaders, certain pastors who will go unnamed for this moment, were so settled, jolly. And I was like, there is something to that. What is going on there?
Yeah.
And part of that has to do with the seriousness of joy. And part of it also has to do with eschatology and I think even behind some of the finer, aside from some of the finer points of eschatology, the settled confidence in what the end is going to be.
Yeah.
And the relief of knowing that's not on me.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yes.
And that sounds like, maybe sounds really stupid to say that, but it was just like, just to know the end state of where this is all going is not on me. And so my foes are vanquished and I'm like, great.
Yeah. It does there's a kind of a double whammy there, right? It reminds me a little bit of so the foes are vanquished. Reminds me a little bit of Packer and how Packer talked about the sovereignty of God actually gave hope for mission, right? And so because the foes are vanquished, it's not like, oh, it's like, it's not on me, thank God, but it also is, I can do all kinds of things and know that it's not my poor performance that's going to put that in question.
Yeah.
But it also inspires a level of like, well, I'm not going to work like a slave, but I'm going to work like a jolly worshiper of God. Right?
Was that his work on election and missions?
It was, I think, the sovereignty and evangelism or something.
Yeah.
Evangelism, the sovereignty of God.
Yes, and
we should
right over there.
Yes, yeah, it's a classic. You should read it if you haven't read it. But we'll just say a quick cheers to Packer. We lost a saint to the Lord this year.
Yes, we did.
We love that man.
His book, Knowing God,
yes,
is one of like the first serious books I ever read.
Same here.
And I was like, it just completely changed the way I think.
Yeah. That the year that I read the 3 super important books for me, most important like introductory books to Christ, the gospel, the church, were Knowing God by J. Packer, and it was all within the same 2 years. Francis Schaeffer, How Should We Then Live, and Desiring God by John Piper. So those are all good books if you haven't sunk your teeth into those yet. But to continue the theme of this idea of worship as warfare, so we've already established that there's this common theme of there's enemies behind the powers, right? There's the darkness behind the powers.
Yeah, Ephesians 6, right? It's not flesh and blood, it's powers and principalities. But I think sometimes we divorce those things and go, flesh and blood is over here and principalities are over here. And it's like, no, there's darkness behind the power. Okay.
Yes. And I think, so one of the things I wanted to kind of highlight is that sometimes I think that when we hear, this idea that, when Christ says, when he's talking to Pilate, my kingdom is not of this world, right? We take that as meaning that, oh, we're just going to sit back and wait for the kingdom, the kingdom that's coming, right? Yeah. Versus we're actually taught to pray, right, by Jesus himself, our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So sometimes when Jesus says my kingdom is not of this world, he doesn't mean it's not here.
Yeah.
He means that it didn't come from here and it's not established here the way that all the empires have been established before through fighting, through cutting off people's heads and whatnot. And so that's why when Peter, attacks the man in the garden and cuts off his ear, he says, no, that's enough, right?
Yeah.
So but that's not to say there's not a real fight and there's not a real battle.
Absolutely.
But as Ephesians 6 goes, it's just a battle with different kinds of weapons, right?
Yes.
And it's the battle. And I think that one of the things that we've, your comment about communion, as in communion we're worshiping God, we're feasting with God, and it's taunting the darkness who are vanquished. But that's our weapons are always the weapons against the vanquished foe, which means that they're always the weapons of their praise, their worship.
Yeah.
So that's something that came up quite a bit when we as we've gone through the Psalms. One of the topics that I brought up in one of the sermons that I preached through the Psalms was like how in the Old Testament that's frequently a way that God defeats enemies. It's through really bizarre, like it doesn't seem like it's an effective way to defeat an enemy, but he defeats them like Jericho through what? Through marching and shouting and blowing horns.
Right, through worship.
Right? Worship, exactly. And then there's a story in Chronicles with King Jehoshaphat where he defeats Moab and Ammon by putting the Levites out in front and having them sing. And then God defeats
They have really bad voices.
Exactly. I mean, they were Levites.
There was no auto-tune and everything.
No auto-tune, and they're on a battlefield. There wasn't very good acoustics.
Yeah.
So
did they have a smoke machine though?
They probably had something like a fire going, maybe a smoke machine. There's some sacrifices in the background. Yeah,
subwoofers for sure.
Yeah, exactly.
All right.
Have you ever heard a shofar blow?
I want to say I have, but I can't remember where and when. But it's the kind of sound that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand.
Yes, it's not a pretty sound.
No, it's not like a smooth alto sax.
No, it's not. No.
Okay. So at the beginning of every Vikings game,
yes,
they have the Viking like horn that's blown, and that's like a shofar, and it means the same thing. It means get ready to take on the enemies.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I always find it super interesting that so many of the Psalms are like fight songs. They're like praying for God to defeat the enemy. And that makes sense if you think of that's how God has chosen to, since he's God and he can defeat the enemy, and yet our participation is primarily through worship. That makes sense that there we'd be given a whole book of songs, and many of them are battle songs, right? Yeah. I forget what psalm it is where he talks about, you've prepared my fingers for battle. And it's fingers. It's not hands. It's fingers. And then at the end of the psalm, it talks about playing harp, which there's this connection between you, like when he plays the harp, he's fighting a battle, right?
Yes.
Very interesting.
I think there's some translations that say Gibson Les Paul.
Yes, Gibson Les Paul. I was thinking it was Telecaster in the translation.
The Vox.
Yes, you must have been reading like the Schofield version.
Oh, that was a low blow.
I know. Schofield doesn't play a Les Paul. He played a
Fender Squier.
Right.
People are like, what are they talking about? It's all right, just ignore it.
So this, just through conversation, it's in reading and preparing these sermons for the Psalms, worship is an incredibly crucial part of what it means to belong to God. And one of the things you said on Sunday was not only that in worship we're bringing something to God, but primarily what's happening is that God is forming us through our worship. Yeah. And I think that that's actually kind of, parallel to how Jesus also calls his followers light and salt, right? And if light and salt are also ways that he is, girding us up to then go into the world and proclaim his goodness, right? That's part of the battle, as it were, as well.
Absolutely.
And it reminds me of, you had mentioned earlier about, I'm losing my train of thought.
Was it communism?
No, it wasn't communism this time. I'll come back to it later. But just the importance of worship. Oh no, this is what it was. We were talking about how in the very, there's a really interesting term in Psalm 29 that's translated as sons of God.
Oh, yeah.
Or and it's often used to refer to children, right?
Yeah.
And how,
right?
What's that?
Oh, sorry. Oh, heavenly beings.
Yes. Oh, heavenly beings. And I, when I heard you say that in the sermon, I thought that's interesting. And I went and did some study myself, and I realized, oh, wow, there's an interesting, I believe it's the term sons of God. And yes, it is often used to refer to children. And it reminded me of when I was teaching through Exodus with the youth. One of the things that we went through is when God speaks to Pharaoh and he says that, let my hosts, my children go, right? Mm-hmm. The word for hosts there is armies. And then he says that they're the children, right? Yeah. And then God takes on this name. He's the Lord of hosts. And oftentimes that's translated as that he's the Lord of the heavenly armies. Yeah. But if you go to Exodus and find out what host means, it means he's Lord of the children, his people, that he's taking out, his armies, right? Yeah. And so when you hear Lord of hosts, you have to imagine yourself in rank, right? With
Right.
the saints, children, like we read about in Psalm 8, who through their crying defeat the enemies.
Yeah.
Right? And that's what in a lot of sense, that's what our worship is crying out to God, is praising God like a child, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So, you and I both like Jamie Smith,
Yes.
and I shared that quote on Sunday, which I'm going to butcher it, but the idea is that worship isn't like necessarily this gift that we give to God. It's not just something we do for God. It is that, but through worship, God reorients and recalibrates our hearts and our minds. It's top down. It's I think he talks about it's the heart of discipleship, because worship is the gymnasium,
Of
you
the
know,
soul, yeah.
of the soul. And so worship is a declaration of war against darkness. It is a taunt. I think you brought up the Psalm 23,
Yes.
where it says, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies." I'm like, that's kind of what communion is.
Yes.
The table that we come to in the presence of our enemies, not being the people in our church,
Yeah.
but the world. But yeah, I totally lost my train of thought. What was I saying before I talked about Psalm 23?
You're talking about how just worship.
Oh yeah, okay, I got you. Okay. Sorry. So worship is like the engine of discipleship.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
But and it's how we are declaring war on the darkness.
Yep.
That has massive implications when it comes to our participation
Yes.
in worship. And
Yeah.
I know something that we have been very, cautious and leery about in this season because of the
Virus.
the virus, and when we had to shut down and go to online only.
Yeah. It's not something we did lightly, and it's something we, as soon as possible, wanted to get away from online only for that reason.
Yeah.
Yes.
So maybe we could talk about like the connection between discipleship and corporate worship, and the option that I think people are like, oh, but it's so comfortable to be at home, or it's just convenient to be here with some friends and to watch stuff online. Maybe you could speak into that.
Yeah. I think that the first thing to say is that I don't want anybody who has like legitimate reasons to not come in person to feel like, oh, I'm guilty of not coming in person. I think that everybody who has illegitimate reasons, or has legitimate reasons why they could come, should come, for the reason that the gathered body in worship, going through the covenant renewal ceremony of call to worship, confession of sins corporately, greeting one another, as a reconciled body, hearing from his word together, eating the supper together as one body, and receiving the benediction and praising him together in song, is all super crucial and important. It's not an accident that the church worships that way. I think that some people are like, well, maybe we should just just rethink what it means to be the church right now. And I'm like, that assumes that the model of the church that we've been doing is not how God wants us to do it, period. It's just kind of like we just kind of do it this way because, and it
was a pragmatic.
It's just pragmatic, exactly. And I think that sadly there is some truth to that, in that a lot of churches don't actually see their Sunday morning worship as anything other than a club meeting to sing songs together and have a nice little fun thing at the end of the week or beginning of the week. Like there are some people who just think that, I could just go to church online. Like there's no real difference. But then think about this. He's the Lord of hosts.
Yeah.
He's the Lord of the armies in rank. And the church is the gathering, right? It's the great assembly. In Leviticus, it talks about the Sabbath gathering as the great convocation, the gathering together.
Yeah.
And so the importance of that, both for now, this is now on top of that, the moment we're in is incredibly dark and confusing, and there's obviously confusion happening, and there can never be a more important time to gather. I think that the evidence of division that you're seeing in our country, but also within churches should be a motivation to say we need to get back together and worship together.
Absolutely.
And I think that I think that for folks that are just like, I don't need to go to church and don't have legitimate reasons to come and worship, I'd say the body needs you.
Yeah.
And that's, you're missing out on how God wants to disciple you. This is how it's not accidental. This is how he set up his church. And if that's kind of confusing to you, like it's something that we want to in the future address through a class, to be honest. And because we do think it's really important, and it's not an accident in history. It's actually God's way of working and forming his church. Yeah. But on the other side, if you're just an individual, but on the other side, if you're just in a group of friends doing it, I think that just need to recognize that the church body needs you. Yeah. And it's not something you just do with a group of friends. It's something that we do together, and that you participate together. There's not really a digital substitute. I think that we wrestled through this years ago, and when we broached the concept of satellite campuses, right, with video, and why we felt like that was just not a legitimate form, because you're not really have a pastor over you. You have a screen over you. Right. You don't really have you're not really worshiping together. You're kind of settling for something and it's not that those things are bad, that you can have that opportunity to do that when you're sick or whatever, but it's not the actual gathering together as a body.
Yeah. And I think that actually the whole world intuitively knows that that's true. Mm-hmm. I think that that sometimes we just get lazy with our discipleship and we don't think through things. So if the church if all that's happening when we get together is the transfer of information, right? So a preacher speaks, there's communication, truth is told. If that's all that's happening, then of course that can happen through any sort of medium. And why wouldn't you just do that in the comfort of your home with your coffee? And you don't have to get up early, you don't have to go anywhere, and you don't have to deal with the annoying, neighbor sitting next to you, or the bad breath of the greeter, or, a million other things. Why wouldn't you do that? But that is really a flattened understanding. It's kind of like the word never became flesh.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the reality is that the whole world understands that type of idea, I can just get it online, is actually horrifically bankrupt.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna lean pragmatic just for a moment to illustrate it. But if you know me, I love football, and I love watching football. And I understand, as do millions of people around our country, that going to a game is not the same as watching it on TV, even though you're watching the exact same event. It's completely different. It's the same game. The outcome is the same. The score is the same. The players are the same. All of the data points are exactly the same. But when you're gathered together with a people, it's different. Every year, our family, not every year, but a lot of years, we've gone to Sacred Sounds, which is a Christmas music performance that SPU does at Benaroya Hall. And so you're in this world-class performing arts center with incredible musicians hearing this music. Now, I could watch it online, and it's not the same.
No.
Everybody knows that. If you ever are away from like a family member for any distance of time, can't you just pull out your phone and FaceTime them? Of course you can. Is it the same? No. So we all know that it's not the same.
Yeah. My sister is stuck in Canada. They won't let her cross the border right now. And we've been Marco Poloing and FaceTiming and whatnot over the last several months, but kind of just figured out we got to figure out a way to meet. And so we found out there's this park, Peace Arch Park, where Canadians can hop a ditch, and there's legally no ramifications the states will take against them in this park. It's like a park that has a treaty behind it, and we jumped on it.
Trying to shut that down, by the way.
They're trying to. Well, the Canada is they shut down their side. That's why all the Canadians are running across on this private road and jumping a ditch to cross over. So we went into Peace Arch Park and we had pizza together. Yeah. So, but yeah, so gathering together is important to worship, and I think that there's also importance to the public nature of it. One of the most famous arguments you'll always hear about people who are skeptical of kind of the way we do church, in terms of a building or whatever, right? And is the early church met in houses, right? And you realize that, okay, so you know what? That's the preferred method for communist regimes. Mm-hmm. Meet by yourself in your house.
Yep.
Why? Ask that question again. Why? Because they know that a public proclamation of Christ is contrary to their vision of the future.
Yes.
Because it is. It's the fact that Christ is Lord over every sphere. That's the reason why the church is a public gathering. That's why you own a building in a public space and you invite people to come to it. It's not, yes, a house is absolutely a means to do so when there's no opportunity otherwise.
Right.
It's not it's not the best method. It's not the best means. So I think that sometimes, again, we have a strictly house church movement. Let's go back to ancient times, has a poor understanding of eschatology and how the lordship of Christ is over every sphere.
Yes.
So
yeah, and it's also selective, right? So somebody will say, oh, we want to go to a house church model because in Acts chapter 2, they had all things in common. They were meeting in houses. It's great. And then do you want Acts 5 too? You want people being struck dead in worship? So we romanticize and then kind of cherry pick these special verses and go, oh, yeah, I want to be like the old time. No, you don't.
Well, and there's a reason why every single time Paul went and preached, and all the first gatherings were where? Synagogue. In the synagogue.
The synagogue. Yeah.
The synagogue literally is, if you had to pick a Hebrew word for the translation of church, mm-hmm. It was synagogue, and it was a public gathering place. So they only met in houses when they got kicked out of the synagogues.
Right, and I think we would both agree that when that is your situation, when you absolutely don't want to, would prefer not to, but when you literally cannot get together in one space together, then gathering in a house is, I think that's fine.
Absolutely faithful.
But that's not our situation.
Yeah.
And I think we're kind of getting off track here, or maybe not. I think one of the reasons people want a house church model is not because of it's not necessarily an anti-facility kind of thing, but the house church model in people's minds doesn't have the authority structures that a corporate church does.
Yeah.
And you won't find that in the New Testament.
Yeah. Absolutely.
There were clearly identified elders and leaders, and there was church discipline, and that was happening. But I think the house church in people's mind is we can get away from authority, we can get away from leadership. It can just be, us together without all of the stuff.
Absolutely.
Sorry,
well, I know we went off some rabbit trails on that one, but I think that the worship is important. It's the way that God has chosen to defeat the darkness.
Yeah.
I think that even in your own life, when you're feeling oppressed, you know what you need to do. You need to worship God. You need to sing his praises. I've been in that place where I've been in a dark spot where singing Come Thou Fount has made me, has chased the darkness away. But it's also the way in which God does that in the world as well. It's his primary means of defeating the darkness. So anyways, I think we should probably wrap up here. We really enjoy having these conversations, and we hope you guys enjoy them too. If you guys have questions for upcoming sermons, we just want to invite you to go to the slido.com link that we share on the live stream and whatnot and ask those questions. We have had a drought of questions, so we've had to just riff off of whatever we want to talk about, which is fine too.
We've got lots to talk about.
All right. Yep.
Can I do a quick shout out before we tune out?
Shout out.
If you're watching this and you're part of Quorum, like, come back. You need to come back. I look at the last 6 months of this whole COVID thing, and I look at it and go, and Rusten, you've said this. Never in the history of the world have all the churches around the world been shut down at the same time.
Yeah.
If you're a Christian and you take the Bible seriously, you should look at that and go, there has to be darkness behind this.
Oh, there is. Yes.
There has to be. And that's not to say that there isn't a virus that infects people and they get sick and die. It's not saying that at all. It's saying that shutting down all the churches around the world for an extended period of time, like, you need to understand that there's a darkness behind that. And it makes people very vulnerable. Yeah. And so, like, for people who are at Quorum, we're saying, you need to come. And if you don't want to register for a service, then still come. And if your conscience genuinely doesn't allow you to put on a mask, not that you're being a stinker about it, but you can't, then come. Like, we have to come together, because and the rest of you've said this so many times, there's something more dangerous than a virus.
Yes.
And the way that we safeguard ourselves against that is by coming together. And just, for the three of you that don't go to Quorum that watch this video, like, go to your church.
Yes.
Go to your church. Your online experience is a great option when there is absolutely nothing else you can possibly do. But for most of you, there is something else you can do. And so you need to be with your local congregation, with your church, worshiping.
Amen.
Okay.
All right. We'll see you next time on Sermon B-Sides. Bye.
See you guys.